Well, I've been thinking about glitches. You know, they are communications breakdowns, right?
Right.
And I was asking you about the space between in your title, to float in the space between. And I'm thinking about it in relation to, as a biographer, as somebody writing a critical biography. We talked a little bit about the question of what is that?
Right, yeah.
And I guess I'm interested in the way that life and work don't necessarily line up, in the way in which there may be, distance between them, or glitches. Now,
well,
go ahead.
Again, this sort of overlaps what I'm presently doing and maybe what I'm always thinking about, which is this idea again of like what confessionalism is, where it relates to poetry. Does it just get divided along like whether it's a lyric poem or a narrative poem? If it's lyric, is it possibly confessional in lyric as soon as you start screwing around with time? So these are just things I just wake up thinking about. They're just, existential relationships. They're not really like subjects necessarily. So the thing I was trying to ask about before we got cut off was like, I'm presently just thinking about it as it relates to Black poets.
Yeah.
For the last couple of weeks, really, I've been trying to write this thing about Yusuf Komunyaka's selected for the last 20 years. And, Yusuf is not a confessional poet. He is something else, like a more lyric poet. I'm not though, for myself. So he's always been so good for me because I do, even in our friendships, I just talk more than he does. You know what I mean? So in writing about it, I'm thinking about that because that means I'm thinking about our friendship, how we communicate again, what's on the poem and what's not on the poem, what's in the world. So trying to like negotiate that right now, because again, it comes back to like, I don't know if I should be telling any of his business when I talk about his poems, because he doesn't tell any of his business when he talks in his poems. You know what I mean? So what I was trying to turn that to, that's just what I'm working on. That's what I've been thinking about. But how it's in a kind of continuum is, I have also thought this about the spectrum which holds Elizabeth Bishop and Frank O'Hara, because both of them are working in, in the throes of confessionalism. I mean, Elizabeth Bishop's obviously friends with the poet who has this mode of, as I said, talking too much. This is how I think myself too. And so for her to not do that, so when I've said it many times, like I think she took so long working on those poems, she got to take out all of the secrets. She could revise and maybe perfect the kind of sense of herself in the poems. So there's that, which is still a kind of confessionalism, it's just manipulated. And the other than that would be like Frank O'Hara, who I would say is like also a confessional poet, but much more uncooked. He's also telling his business and talks too much. And yet we just sort of have
to buries it by talking too much, right?
Right. And even Merrill, I wonder, so I guess I'm saying to you, an ongoing question that I have always is this thing that you just proposed about the Etheridge Knight book, which is always a question of where is the line between the life and the work? Because I struggle with it, myself, about what to tell and what not to tell, when my relatives are quiet. Even Yusuf, when I think Yusuf's quiet, sometimes I think he's thinking Terrance is going to go run in his mouth. And so it so happens that we just don't really talk that much about poems or deep tragedies that, that we both have relationships to. And so it just comes back to Bishop too. And I think ultimately, I'll just shut up when I say, I'm always torn between being one to be like Bishop, a little reticent, taking my time to make a really perfect thing that has really as little of my ego in it as possible, like enough time to kind of take that out and put some polish on it. And wanting to be like, Frank O'Hara, wake up every day, dash a poem out, go be social. It's all connected to the life. Everything you live is coming back into that poem. And even at, I'll be 50 this year, I still can't settle. I still feel torn always between those two impulses.
Yeah. I think you started, before we glitched, you started to ask a question specifically in relation to Black poetry about whether you can, why would you want to, why wouldn't you want to call Etheridge Knight or Lucille Clifton a confessional poet? Yeah.
And I am putting it next to, like a kind of academic definition of, wherever the studies have gone in terms of what confessionalism is. So again, like, is it M.L. Rosenthal, as I said, Lowell, there's people do it with the Black arts poet, like saying, the Black arts poets are Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Haku Madhubuti, and then I'm saying, well, it's true. When they put out this book in 1968, The Black Fire, edited by Baraka, Stanley Crouch was in it, all those other folks, Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, but people who were not in it were Robert Hayden, Audre Lorde. Well, this is 1968. Gwendolyn Brooks, Etheridge Knight, Lucille Clifton. So to say, but all those people are Black arts poets because they're working in the same era. So you have to, any conversation about the Black arts has to be sort of along some spectrum that includes all those poets that are left out of it. So I think that about confessionalism too. Like it's very interesting to think about Elizabeth Bishop's relationship to confessionalism, for me anyway, and to even want her to be something like that, which just makes Sylvia Plath more interesting, to think that they're in conversation somehow with the notion of where your life stops and where your poems start, So obviously for Black poets, but that's because of the use of thing. I'm always thinking about it. Somebody like Wanda Coleman is very interesting to me. I think she struggles in the same way in her work that I do. That's the appeal.
Same period.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm also thinking, why don't we think of Black poets as confessional poets, or why is that rubric not part of discourse about African American poetry?
Exactly.
Which is interesting. Which is
Lucille Clifton, Brooks. I mean, you start thinking about these guys through that lens. But it's still, I guess I'm saying, I don't know if we're still warming up or if we're at it yet, because I'm still going towards a question about Bishop too. Like, where is Bishop's line too? Like you're saying to me, I see it in the title of your book. I'm saying like, yeah, that's always there. Where is this line? But I'm sort of saying to you, will you talk to me about Bishop's notion of like privacy and secrecy? Did she think like Lowell jabbered too much? I know about the thing with the Sistina, where he's sort of writing from her point of view about her childhood. I know that he was chronically, telling everybody's business. So I guess I'm wondering where she fits in that kind of relationship.
I just thinking about life and work, I have this little quotation from a letter that she wrote to Marianne Moore in 1943. So she's 32 years old.
Right.
And she's been trying for years already to publish a first book, and she hasn't gotten it together. And she's writing in, as she often does, in some kind of self-punishing performance to Moore, who's her very eccentric, mentor. And she says, I feel I must do something about my life and works. And she uses that phrase, life and works, with the ampersand, just, as if it were something in print.
Right.
Very soon, this wastefulness is a sin, but I can't figure out what. And she's writing about the difficulty of publishing.
Yeah.
And she's kind of making fun of her ambition, by saying life and works, as if this 32-year-old is going to get a biography and sit on a shelf with all those canonical poets. At the same time, she seems actually kind of ambitious about it. So both self-mocking and ambitious. And, I think she had a kind of fundamental ambivalence about publishing. And it has to do with the issues that you're talking about privacy, about resisting kind of turning a life into, something on a shelf or something in a store.
Yeah.
And it has everything to do with queerness, but queerness understood as sexuality, but also as an orientation to the world and to the social.
As a poet, all poets are queer. That the notion of writing a poem is a queer notion.
That's
so
right.
certainly.
And it was
in the, in the original sense of it, I guess. I mean, I know there are more deeper political resonances now, but you're right. Like that core meaning of it has something to do with just a slant. Dickinson, see the world, seeing the world with the kind of slant on it. I think Dickinson is a first queer poet too.
Boy, is she.
Mm-hmm.
Although
I just think about all these overlaps. Even to say like, the only person, one of the first people to really write about a relationship to Dickinson, sort of in an academic sense, would be somebody like Adrienne Rich. But because all of those years before we got, sort of like a true kind of Dickinson poem, there's all these gaps with other people where you wonder what their view of that, so you would be like, Bishop's view of Dickinson was not the right view because, it was so late in the game by the time, it's the 50s, by the time we get something. So you wonder like, well, what would be Dickinson's relationship to Bishop, or Bishop's relationship to Dickinson, I should say.
Yeah, you can hear her reading Dickinson when she's a teenager in terms of very early poetry. And obviously, reading it in those kind of awful early editions, but and not seeing necessarily the poet that she would see later and that Rich would write about. Yeah, I had, I guess, in thinking about this kind of life and work issue, just as a biographer, I'm thinking about how do you tell a story about life and work when it isn't the simple story that I lived this and then I wrote about it, or I lived this and therefore I wrote this way, or this was my experience and here's the result, the outcome. I mean, which is this kind of linear chronological relationship to them. I want, I've got a couple of quotations about time from Bishop, but I really like what you have to say about time in To Float in the Space Between. You're writing about feeling fucked up, which, by the way, I love the idea that this Etheridge Knight poem is a translation of Western Wind. It's absolutely. Anyway, you say, feeling fucked up relies, the poem, but I think also the feeling, right, relies on lyric time. Lyric time is a crisis of narrative, a story spiraling out of control. It makes the structure of desire, and I would say maybe living too, revolutionary, with that word's dual connotations of subversiveness and circularity. Anyway, I really like that. Tell me more about lyric time.
Yeah, I mean, I do think of, narrative time is essentially a straight line. I'm going to get this back to this Bishop Moore thing that I wanted to observe about poems and poets. So if I forget, we'll put a pin on that one. But broadly speaking, I always talk to my students about it. Like, essentially, life is fairly linear. Like, it's even structured linearly. You wake up in the morning, you do something in the afternoon, and you go to bed. And the most exciting thing that happened during that line was really the point of the day. So that's how you get, Freytag's triangle. You just need any interesting thing. And so there's no pressure on what it could just be like a great lunch. So that means, okay, the point of your day was this great lunch. So you write your narrative of how you got to that and how it changed the day afterwards, no matter when it happened. So that, to me, is everyday life. That's narrative. But the lyric time is that circle of obsession of like not being able to get off a point, whatever that point might be, love, heartbreak, whatever. So I do think that question of where the real drama comes from is connected to when you sort of can't stay focused enough to do this thing and then that thing happens. You can't get off that point. So, and broadly, you can break a couple of poets around like that. I think there's probably another category of time, which is something like rhetorical time that I have to meditate on. I still think about it. Like currently, maybe that's a Mary Ruefle, Dean Young, or, historically, maybe he's even an Ashbery kind of poet. Like, is Ashbery lyric or narrative, his relationship to time? And you'd be like, I think it's actually rhetorical. So I don't, again, this is just Terrance making stuff up. I don't know what shape that would be, but that's broadly, how I teach it and how I think about it.
Yeah.
And then the desire to kind of braid those two things is, ongoing interest.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want me to ask you this question? It's just about drama. Like,
Sure.
the biographer's decision to write about the poet or write about the poem. So this, I'm asking you a question here around this notion, because I sort of feel like, outside of the realm, as a consumer of the biography, the literary biography, or even the literary movie, and I was joking about letting Meryl Streep play Bishop. It is because, as interesting the poems are, the life is in fact the thing that you would be selling around Bishop, just around humanity. Like, it so happens she's a magnificent poet, but the humanity in that life is so dynamic. So when I think about like her, same thing about Marianne Moore, like I have a handful of good Marianne Moore poems, but not as extensive in terms of just like, things you read before you go to bed, not as extensive as it would be for Bishop for me. So I just relentlessly am returning to Bishop. So Marianne Moore becomes interesting to me, narratively in her relationship to Bishop. So like a movie, again, where I'm observing these two amazing women living in this wild time where they shouldn't even exist. The things that they're doing, so amazing. So it just so happens that as a reader of biography or a viewer of movies, I find myself always drawn to the poet more than the poem. Like how many biographies are we just sitting there hearing them read them poems? Those biographies don't work, you know what I mean? Or the movies, where we just we get the poems. So I guess I'm saying the biographer has such an interesting or precarious relationship to knowing that the thing that you're most interested in maybe doesn't have any like true dramatic/cinematic. It's a question. Does it have any true cinematic or dramatic value? So you do come down to deciding, am I really writing about this poet or the poems? Karen maybe has this too, writing about the mysterious and enigmatic John Ashbery. Like ultimately, maybe she is going to write about those poems. As interesting as Ashbery is, where is that in terms of, again, the work lifeline? What are you obligated to show us this incredible human being or this incredible poet? I mean, obviously you want to do both. I get that, but
right. But and then how do you do both? When I first started writing,
so interesting. Nobody knows how interesting she is. You know what I mean? Everybody knows she's a dynamic poet, but nobody knows how interesting she is just as a woman to have walked the earth. You know what I mean?
I think that, well, in Bishop's case, I think that has to do, the way to get there is actually through writing. Maybe not only, certainly through the poems, but through her notebooks, her letters, all the stuff that she produced. I mean, she is a poet who wrote these, 100 perfect poems, or at any rate, perfect seeming poems, or perfect enough for the time being.
Yeah, better than most.
But it's the tip of the iceberg. She would produce this astonishing, messy, glitchy archive. And I think,
and was herself a kind of a glitchy personality too. I've seen all kinds of, this is true for Stein too, always, the poet of color has to make a decision how to handle, things that people say in letters. So Bishop goes there too, and still to me, that goes to the glitch. It goes to the notion of like, for me anyway, and I would say that any poets of color younger than me would agree with that.
Now that we're just talking about race for a moment right now, in terms of Bishop, that's a big glitch. And I'm thinking,
one has to decide. One has to decide, whether even to think of it as a glitch, really,
Yeah. Well,
but again, all the interesting stuff, that's the messiness. When you say messy, that goes under that umbrella. And so you want to be able to talk as critically about all of the messiness as opposed to like, not everything. In the spirit of like, she was so, again, I would say, so much more interested than people know. And that to me is featured in that kind of dynamic, like roundness of personality or whatever.
Right. Yeah. That's right. I had Freitag's triangle on the screen for a minute there because I put it in my little PowerPoint that I was making because you have it in the book.
Yeah, that's right.
Just before you talk about feeling fucked up. And anyway, let me go back to it for just a minute. It's such a kind of
that's drama. That's why I said the thing about drama and cinema. Like, it is the root of all drama, right?
Yeah. Okay, there we've got this pattern. Well, Bishop, when she's a young person, she's in her 20s, she's in college, she's writing these really interesting essays about time. And she talks in one of these essays. Whoops, there she is. There she's. I like this one. I think she's dreaming there. We got to look at her. She's dreaming.
Elizabeth Taylor is what that looks like.
Anyway, in this essay called Dimensions for a Novel, where she's talking about finding literary form for experience.
Right.
She first starts out talking about, well, I've had to write all these diagrams of these novels. But if I was really going to write a diagram of, the way we live, it's going to be different. She says, we live in great whispering galleries, constantly vibrating and humming, or we walk through salons lined with mirrors. The reflections between the narrow walls are limitless, and each present moment reaches immediately and directly the past moments, changing them both. So if she's going to draw another diagram of the development of novels or of life, I'm afraid they would look like a bramble bush, which is a different kind of diagram. Yeah. So let me show you another quotation. She talks about something called experience time. She says, is it possible there may be a sort of experience time where the time pattern in which realities reach us quite different from the hour after hour, day after day kind? The crises of our lives do not come, I think, accurately dated. They crop up unexpected and out of turn, and somehow or other arrange themselves according to a calendar we cannot control. Anyway, I really like that, and
that's great.
I guess I'm trying to think about how to write a life of her and of her writing, kind of biography of the writing that would be more like the kind of diagram that she's talking about, and it would somehow, render this thing that she's calling experience time.
The question for me becomes, how interested is she in recording this notion of experience time? So it does send you back to the poems, like even maybe in the waiting room, thinking about poems where she is actually, a lot of those poems feel like little archives, of moments. She's very much trying to hold something still. So it's like, are the poems resistance to this kind of experience time that's just a bramble, or are the poems trying to relay that kind of bramble? So again, if I just throw her up again with the, contemporary like Frank O'Hara, I would say Frank O'Hara likes the bramble, like the way his poems are opening up. He's just leaning into what she calls experience time. But I really think she seems to be like trying to get more control over it, you know what I mean? As opposed to kind of submitting to this question of like this disorder.
Well, actually, I think that poem is all about that. Here's a little girl saying what day of the week it is, where she is in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Right.
The thing that's really powerful for me about that poem is that it was written in 1967. Right. And it's remembering 1918.
Right.
And she is in the poem, the child she's writing about has been displaced from her home.
Right, that's right.
Or what she has taken to be her home in Canada. And Bishop is writing at the same time that she's been displaced from her home in Brazil.
Interesting.
She's been forced to separate from her lover, Lota. And Lota has just been, and Bishop has just been in a hospital.
Right.
Or in Lota's case, severe depression. In Bishop's case, alcoholism and anxiety, and they both been through shock treatment. And now she's writing this in New York City.
Yeah, that's great.
And she's writing it in the week of the Newark riots. She's writing it, or maybe a week after the Newark riots. She's writing it, during while Vietnam is escalating. And there is, I think, in the poem built in a kind of experience time where these different life moments and life stories and kind of biographical turns are kind of overlaid at the same time. And you're right. I think she's kind of trying not to give into what would be the craziness.
Right. Yeah.
Of the condition, and yet at the same time, she's also writing it.
Yeah, well, all that information, I knew most of that, even about the hospitals. I didn't know she was writing that poem from New York, but all that information, it just makes me think about the spirit of the child, the kind of shock. She's not just like curious, the view of the child, and that is someone who's like dumbstruck in some ways. So whatever that gaze is, even if we don't know it's a contemporary view, the mood of like, what the fuck is going on? That's the feeling of that kid in that poem. Like, what is going on? It's that kind of mood. It gets so much more interesting when you think about that, because what you're doing for me, and I hope this is what the book is doing, is really resisting what I'm trying to set up here, which is the cool, precise, surgical bishop on one end of a kind of confessional spectrum, and then wild, hot, O'Hara, and you're really suggesting something else about inverting that kind of idea. She becomes a lot more hot, when you think about this view of time and what she sort of has just at the edges of the poem, which I think is right. I mean, she's hot. I've always known she was a hot-blooded poet. But again, I feel like she works so hard to kind of like keep that under control in those poems.
Right. Yeah. Well, she's writing under, you feel as though, she's writing under terrific pressure. And you're looking at notebooks, and their very fragmentariness is a picture of that pressure.
I mean, the biographer's work is so important. Remembering now that what I wrote is something that hopes a biographer will do a biographer at Etheridge Knight. The work is so important in the absence, it's a correction for like the absent memoir. Like, we live in an era now where like everybody, I'm never gonna do a memoir. And no shade to people who have done it. Some of my best friends have written memoirs. But I do feel like we're in an era now where the memoir is just sort of a default extra that comes with a certain kind of visibility, right? So before that moment, though, the memoirs you really want is like, I want a memoir from Elizabeth Bishop. I mean, those sentences, I think this about someone who's still alive, Sonia Sanchez, who for years people have said there was going to be one. And even Baraka, who sort of wrote, something like a memoir. So I'm saying that these great big lives, that we only have biography to give us that kind of view that you're giving us. Whereas everybody else is like, I'm telling my story, we don't need biographers, I'm going to tell my story these days. But there's something like it, you just make me realize the absence of something like that genre for so many poets and writers in general before, for the 90s even.
Well, we were talking the other day about the the archival gaps in a life like Etheridge Knight's, and how difficult that is.
I do think there's work that has to be done, and I say it mostly as a consumer of the genre of the literary biography, or consumer of the great story of any kind of artist, And so I do, what I feel is the absence of like these guys speaking for themselves. So again, even in this most recent one of the last things I did was edit, this Wanda Coleman selected poems. My impulse was just to be like, she did write this really weird kind of memoir thing called The Riot in Me. So, you want to just like give all of their own, let's set them up to do their own speaking, essentially, and as little contextualizing as possible. But when you sort of lay it up that way, things get left out, because again, there's obviously things that Bishop would not have wanted in her sort of biography or in her Wikipedia page, you know what I mean? But you're like, that's what we're looking for. We're looking at all the stuff that you making sure ain't on that page. So it's good. I mean, again, as I said, my brutishness shows how like how I say these kinds of things, like the end of every great literary work is a movie of some sort. We hope it's a good movie, it might not be, but I've always sort of thought that about.
Have you seen a good movie of a
It's in the future.
That's biopic of a writer?
Look, man, I did this interview in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago with Spike Lee, and it was for not a good movie. I think it was the Chirac movie about like this like an opera type thing. It was terrible, and so I was trying to figure out how to talk to him without saying, without sort of lingering on this movie. So I just said to him, which actually turned out to still be an insult, but something I believe. I said to him, there's just so many great untold stories. You don't ever have to write another story because you can't write, but you could do like a movie about Frederick Douglass. You do a movie. So I was talking to him in much the way I think about this question of like Hollywood, this question of like, well, if we're going to go to the movies, let's go to the movies and see some really great stories. And my point to him, and my point to even something like a Bishop biography, is like so many untold, amazing stories about however you want to look at it, being a woman, being an American, being of a certain period. There's just all these amazing stories, and yet we constantly have these terrible movies. They're so reductive of these lives, and so so I don't know when that'll be. It might be 50 years, right, before we get something that's an accurate view of what it is that you're writing right now. Yeah. But I do feel like, that's why I say the thing, when you're talking about the poets, there is a kind of cinematic and also maybe humanistic appeal to it, that you're like, these people are writing poems while doing all this other stuff. Like, lo and behold, your grandmama's writing poems, your gardener's writing poems, and they're living these lives. So that is sort of the great encouragement, I think, that gets revealed in these biographies, the way that these people are, geniuses while also just being neurotic, alcoholic, again, queer, whatever you want to think of, like abnormal people. I said something somewhere the other day where I was at a reading, and I was like, well, who would ever want poets really in the university? Like, if you know what a poet is, clearly people don't, because they're like, yeah, go teach my kids. Like, poets are maniacs. So, that's just always true. Bishop's a maniac, Merrill's a maniac, Knight's a maniac. It just sort of comes with the territory.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and that think about the people who were teaching poetry classes while Bishop was writing, and people like John Berryman. That's a wild man.
Another confessional poet, as far as I'm concerned, it gets very interesting to think about a relationship between Berryman and the confessional mode.
How do you react to Berryman?
I like the dream songs.
Yeah,
I like the dream songs. Yeah. I mean, again, we're on record now, so I shouldn't be saying any contemporary names.
Yeah.
But there are, Berryman. There's few of these kinds of poets, maybe even since like a poet like a Franz Wright passed away. Again, like saying names, but I'm going to say somebody like also Frank Bidart. Like, let's call them the eccentric poets. They're pure poets, but they're so pure that it's hard to know where to put them. So Berryman can be like that. He's just it's why, again, not to romanticize it, but it would make sense that he would burn out in a certain kind of way. You know what I mean? Because a poet like that, those kinds of energy, it's going to be inconsistent, but also just, you ain't going to get it from anywhere else. You're just not going to get Berryman in any other pocket of the canon, I don't think. Is there anybody like him? Maybe Bob Kaufman, you know what I mean? Like, who's like Berryman in the canon? There just isn't anybody. So yeah, I think he's good, but it's mostly that dream songs. That's the superior. The other work is good. Obviously, I like the sonnets.
You're making me think about the first American sonnet. I can't quote it right now, but the winos.
Who the ancestors really are. Yeah. No, I think it's true. It has to be said. For non-poets, beware of the poets. So it's not a bad position, though. It's a necessary position. I personally, I think of myself as someone, from playing basketball and being, raised by people in prison guards and military people. I think I'm more adept at like not being crazy. That doesn't mean I'm not crazy. I just have maybe a deeper sense of discipline than most poets ever have to encounter.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I could be like an ambassador because I just know how to behave a little bit better than most. That doesn't mean it's usual. Doesn't mean one should expect to behave poet. Well, but those are the ones we're trying to save. I think, again, the gesture of the biography, recovering a certain dimension of the poet's presence, you know, whether it's in the poems or not. Like to me, there are, you know, the two tracks essentially, that track of the poet and that track of the poem.
Beware the poets. That seems like a good note to end on.
Yeah. A good. That's right. It's a good thing. Like beware exclamation point, not, you know, it's a good thing. We want to say it as a praise, a gesture towards praise.